Welcome to everyone that's here. My name is Jennifer Adams, and I'm the editor-in-chief with the Knowledgehook Signature Leadership Series, and I'm a proud executive committee member of Karunga. And welcome to the SEL Global Leadership Series. We've been doing these sessions since last March, since the beginning of the pandemic, and it is hosted by three partners that I will introduce shortly. And our topic today is SEL looking back at 2020 and what a year it has been. Our first partner in our organization is Karunga. It is an organization that's been in existence for about 18 months. It is a global alliance for SEL and life skills, and we are thrilled to be able to do advocacy work, connecting community work, implementation support, and provide some cutting edge research in our global community around the world. So welcome you to take a look at that organization and to sign up and have access to what is there. Our second partner is Salzburg Global Seminar, and Salzburg Global Seminar is a nonprofit that emerged after the Second World War in 1947. And the owner of this location in Salzburg, Austria, got together with a couple of American leaders and decided to create a place that would really talk about and help support future leaders to shape a better world coming out of the Second World War. It certainly seemed like a necessary organization, and in some ways, sadly, today we still need that. They are a network. They've got fellows from 180 countries around the world and do all sorts of interesting sessions on everything from healthcare to global finance systems to education, and have been a great meeting place for many of the world's leaders. Our third partner is Knowledgehook, and Knowledgehook is a Canadian global math company and digital math company, and they have been doing great work in sponsoring thought leadership for teachers and for school principals. And really the Signature Leadership Series is just their honoring of senior education leaders to be able to connect and to hear on some great topics. There are basically three different pillars. The one is Education 2030. So what are the trends in education globally? The second pillar is future skills. So looking at that broad set of skills and what business leaders are saying are needed in the workplace. And the final pillar is improving math achievement, and very much at a high level, looking at district improvement plans and national improvement plans, and how we can help support our math leaders at our district or in our countries, and as well as in the schools. So lots there, and you're welcome again to sign up with that, knowledgehook.com/leadership, and all of the resources are free to anyone that signs up. So we're going to get right into our conversation today. We have registrants from 5 Canadian provinces, from 14 US states, and from 11 countries. And actually, for the first time, there's a big contingent in from my former school district, the Ottawa Public School Board in Canada. And so a huge shout out to them and welcome. It's great to have you here with us. We have kind of come up with some questions, and of course don't need anyone to be reminded of the crazy and challenging year 2020 has been. So we've put some questions just to kind of guide the conversation that Dominic will lead with the two panelists. How has that experience of school shutdown expanded the need for social emotional learning? We're going to ask the panelists to share some examples of some great practices, either in schools or in post-secondary. We'll ask them their opinion on whether or not the challenges of 2020 have actually advanced the whole notion of SEL being really mainstreamed in education systems. And finally, we're always looking for great advice from these leaders that we get to work with. So they'll have an opportunity to be sharing some of that advice with us. It is really my pleasure to introduce to you the panelists that we'll have here. We are being hosted by who I think of as one of the best facilitators of conversations that I know. Dominic Register is the program director at Salzburg Global Seminar. He is also a fellow executive member from Karunga. He has a long history of working with the British Council in many countries around the world, and has been with Salzburg Global Seminar for a few years now. Our two panelists, Saren Stewart is the an associate professor at Miag School of Education at the University of Connecticut. Saren comes from the Caribbean and did some amazing work there. She was the deputy dean for the Faculty of Humanities and Education at the University of the West Indies. And she has won some pretty significant awards. She was the 2019 Vice Chancellor Award for Excellence from the University of the West Indies. And she was also the 2018 African Diaspora Emerging Scholar Award by the Comparative and International Education Society. She's done really interesting work on equity and decolonization, and that's such an important topic for us to embed in everything that we're doing now. Finally, my pleasure to introduce you to Laura Hamilton, who is the General Manager of Research Centers at ETS in Princeton. And before that, a long-standing leader in RAND Corporation. She was the adjunct behavior scientist and served as a distinguished chair in learning and assessment and directed RAND Center for Social and Emotional Learning Research. So as you can see from those very brief introductions, we've got some great people to be having a conversation with. I'm going to pass it over to Dominic and just remind people that are on with us, we've got the chat there. We want this to be really interactive, so don't hesitate to ask questions, and our panelists will interact with you through the chat. So over to you, Dominic.
Thanks, Jen. Welcome, everybody. As we said in the text around this session, at the beginning of August this year, the UN Secretary General described the COVID-19 pandemic as having led to the largest disruption of education in history. Over 1.5 billion children were affected, with the most vulnerable, and this is the Secretary General's words, learners with disabilities, those in minority or disadvantaged communities, displaced and refugee students, and those in remote areas at the highest risk of being left behind. In the same speech, the Secretary General also spoke about how we were at a defining moment for the world's children and young people, and that there was a generational opportunity to reimagine education because of COVID-19. In many ways, I think that 2020 will be remembered as a year of convergent crises. So there was the pandemic, there is also the escalation around the climate crisis, there was the learning crisis that predates the pandemic in many contexts, the mental health crisis that young people have been facing for several years, increasing intergenerational conflict, and the increasing realization that the world is not really on track to meet any of the Sustainable Development Goal targets. Social and emotional learning is a legitimate component of the necessary response to all of these crises. It's not the only thing which is needed, but it is a key part of what is needed. And that's something that we at Karanga and at Salzburg Global Seminar and at Knowledgehook feel very strongly about. We're going to reflect on this a bit during the conversation and think about the status of social and emotional learning in different education contexts throughout the year. So Sarah and Laura, it's fantastic to have the chance to speak with you both. Thank you very much for joining us for the final SEL Leadership Roundtable of 2020. We're going to structure the conversation between the three of us loosely around the rhetoric and then the reality and then the need for SEL and how these things have ebbed and flowed at different speeds in different places and at different times during the year. For everyone who's joining us live, thank you so much for giving of your time to be with us and persevering after the technical challenges at the beginning. Please feel free to post questions in the chat on Zoom. Remember, when you post a question, to set it to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see it, and feel free to engage with each other. If you know of the answer to a question or a great article or research report or any other useful resources that would help with the response to any questions, then please share them there. We have a mantra here at Salzburg Global to be tough on the issues but kind to each other. So please feel free to disagree with any of us or with one another in the chat, but keep that mantra in mind. So Saren and Laura, it's been a very strange and difficult year for people all around the world. And the burden of that difficulty and the consequences of it have not fallen equally. And we've seen and will continue to see inequalities within countries and between countries grow. But that said, at various points in the year, it does feel like there's been some optimism about the education reform initiatives that could come out of 2020, and that interest in social and emotional learning has increased. And so I would love to open our conversation with your reflections on the year, and especially the rhetoric or discourse around SEL. So Saren, if we could start with you, please.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So majority of my context will definitely be situated within the Caribbean and predominantly in Jamaica. And it does provide a good comparative lens with the US, as I am a mother of two young girls currently in the school system, one in kindergarten and the other in the 6th grade. And so just having both of their reports and analyzing the indicators for actually SEL was really interesting as I was preparing for this talk. So back in March, when it seemed like most of the Western world, particularly in the Caribbean, all shut down, around 7 million of that billion number that you just mentioned, Dominic, in the Caribbean were affected and still are affected till today. We received or experienced our first real surge around the middle of summer, to be quite honest with you. So between March and around July, we were still doing fairly well. In fact, by the time I had migrated or returned back to the US, because, you know, moving in a pandemic, we had literally 10 deaths in Jamaica. You could count on two hands how many deaths due to COVID. And we had a very manageable case outbreak as well. But then with the onset of elections, which is obviously mirrored in the US comparatively, we saw our surge. And what that essentially did was crippled our system, and it crippled our education system till today. So schools did not reopen for distance learning until October the 5th, right? So far behind our normal school year. In addition to that, they are still closed till today. And as you can imagine, in global southern countries with very resource-stricken countries that are highly dependent on tourism, these countries' bounce back effect is not predicted to happen for a number of years. And as a result, our kids are feeling it the most, or parents as well, and so the entire community. And the issues that are being exacerbated are exactly what you said. We have students who there are 16 persons in one room, and school used to be that outlet, that space to get outside of that one room space. And when that's no longer there, we're seeing reports come out of the UNICEF, out of the ministries of education, of higher increases of violence, shouting, spankings, as well as general violence in the society as well, because there are a lot more layoffs, job losses, etc. And so you're seeing an exacerbation of essentially behaviors around boredom, is what some of the indicators that they're using, around violence, around trying to fill the time of just being completely ignored. In some instances. And so children are really holding the brunt of that. There are parents, of course, and there are teachers, and there are many initiatives being put forward. And so when we talk about social and emotional learning, I think this forum is so critical, because the reality is the nomenclature might be different and changes and it wavers, but the practices have been very similar. But they're contextual to each country's context. And when you deal with a post-colonial context that's predominantly of African descent, and so you're dealing with a multiplicity of languages, of accents, of dialects, that also has to play a role in how social emotional learning practices are done, are valued, are measured. And that is what we are now seeing, that at the beginning of COVID, there was a streamlining of it. Actually, I just completed supervising a PhD student at the University of the West Indies, soon to be Dr. Rohan Makalo, who did his entire dissertation mixed method study on teachers' social emotional management skills, right? And measuring it across a mixed method study, and really looking at this practice that has been there and how COVID, however, has disrupted and impacted it. And so there's a lot of questions right now that we're all grappling with for how we will get back to a state of trying to require SEL training support for the entire educational community. And that is what we're trying to push forward.
So actually that's a different experience, isn't it, to the one that I was outlining, that the rhetoric and the interest was there pre-pandemic, and the pandemic has shut down a lot of those conversations because the reality has superseded, or the perception of what was most needed has kind of superseded the SEL conversations. Laura, one of the really interesting things about talking to you both is that you both undertook really significant changes during the pandemic in terms of employment and moving internationally. But Laura, with your RAND hat on and your ETS hat, do you think how do you think the rhetoric around SEL has played out this year?
Yeah, so I could elaborate on just about everything Saren said. It was a great summary. It's very sobering and really did a nice job of highlighting what the concerns are. And I'll, just as background, most of my work has been done in the US. And a lot of what I have learned about how educators are addressing SEL has come from RAND's nationally representative survey panel. So we've done a lot of work surveying teachers and principals in schools across the country. And I think a couple of things that have really kind of come through as we've been doing that work is, first of all, there has been growing interest and commitment to SEL in the US and as well as around the world, but my data are from the US. Over the last few years. Schools have always, thought about trying to get kids to, get along with one another and develop, character virtues and things like that. But the commitment to sort of explicitly developing SEL skills and the understanding of how they contribute to students' readiness for college and career has been growing in recent years. And so we hear from teachers and principals that they are absolutely prioritizing SEL. They were doing it before the pandemic and they continue to do it. A lot of the work I've done in the last couple of years has been around civics. And I think extending how we think about SEL to incorporate those civic engagement kinds of competencies that are so important. And again, we're seeing that teachers really think that this is important. What's changed as a result of the pandemic is the opportunity to promote those skills. So, before the pandemic, we heard from a lot of teachers who were really prioritizing those one-on-one relationships with kids, trying to develop school climates where everybody felt that they belonged and had a trusted adult they could go to. So all of those social supports that schools have been providing, as well as, developing skills like collaboration, communication, critical thinking through group projects and efforts to really get kids together and talking with one another and grappling with complicated problems together. And so when schools went remote, educators, a lot of them really had a hard time shifting their instructions so that they could continue to offer those opportunities to children. So I think that what's become very clear is the need for high quality, both instructional materials and guidance around relationships and engagement as kids are learning remotely. And then I'll say one other thing, which is that in the US and around the world, the protests around racial justice and equity that happened and got just lots of attention and just really raised the level of urgency to address a problem that has been with us for all time, but now schools are really facing an explicit set of pressures to make sure they're addressing those. And this is another area where I think educators are trying to think about how can we bring SEL into this and help kids develop, an appreciation for different cultures and the ability to have constructive conversations around these very thorny issues. And again, how do you develop those skills in a remote learning environment? It's hard enough to do it in the classroom, but it's even harder when you're all separated and talking through computer screens.
Have either of you seen examples of good practice around addressing that specific challenge of, you know, whether it is through an online learning environment or whether it's another manifestation of remote or distance learning? Have you seen good practice that you can direct us all to?
So I can start. You know, I think that there's been a lot of guidance put out for educators by, you know, organizations like CASEL and Transforming Education around both how to have these sort of, you know, really important, courageous conversations around racial justice, and how to do that, how to engage kids in those kinds of relationship building activities remotely. So I think there's guidance out there, and there are some curricula that have been developed. So I think a good one is Facing History in Ourselves is a curriculum that's been in place for a while, and that has some units that are really relevant to these topics. You know, there's so other curriculum providers have been trying to think about how to give educators guidance around how to implement these things remotely. So there's definitely some examples. I can provide a more coherent response later and share some more specific examples. But I think there's stuff for people to draw on, and one of the constraints we're hearing from educators is just that they need their school districts and their school leadership to support the use of these materials and the opportunities to build the time into their schedule to do this. So I think it's both they need access to the information and the materials and the lesson plans, but then they need the internal supports from their school system to really be able to offer them. And sometimes there's no time in the schedule, or there's just not the leadership support to engage in those kinds of activities. So it's a combination of things that needs to happen.
Right. So I'm glad, Laura, that you touched on that point as the other pandemic that has, you know, a number of us in the fight against anti-Blackness and anti-Blackness racism has really debated how to really infuse this in US curriculums in particular. But so comparatively, Dominic, to your question about strategies that have been used, I've seen where, for example, here, I've seen district level programming that is embedded throughout for teacher training in particular, and then doubled through children and parents logging on as well, right? So that's a district level programming, and they'll implement that and have a variety of SEL workshops and webinars and seminars that the entire community can engage with. In regards to the Caribbean in particular, I want to be very distinct that the Caribbean is not a monolithic group as well. And so in particular to the Anglophone, former British colonial Caribbean, you tend to see that the SEL training, programming, curriculum is designed around the guidance counselor's role. And there is particularly one person role. And when you have schools of upwards of 1,200, 1,600 students, because we have overcrowding in schools, overcrowding in classrooms, you'll have one guidance counselor to the entire school. So in terms of a systematic implementation, resources aren't there. Now, where they need to head to, which some schools and mostly private schools in the primary level or elementary level would be the preparatory schools that go up to grade 6, will have the infusion of professional development training for their teachers, absolutely. But most of these countries are high stakes testing as a legacy of British examination from Cambridge, etc., that we know 50 years after independence, they still partake in, even through COVID, which is alarming, as you can imagine, because the gap in learning has increased and exacerbated as well. There is no metrics on these high stakes tests right now or indicators for SEL, but we know that SEL is a predictor for academic achievement and academic success, right? And so the importance of really drilling down, how do we balance the current needs with what we know from research as can be a good predictor. As we've said, there's some data out there that SEL can predict up to 11% on a standardized test higher rates. So it really is a great investment for school systems to look at that and how they can implement it in civics, in social studies, in integrated studies, whichever subject matter that is the equivalency of, or throughout, in fact. But that question about balance is real. And that question right now, when most of these societies are grappling with some of their basic needs being met, I'm talking about parents who are at the middle class level have in a span of 2 months been dropped down to below middle class, right? And that has significant implications for basic needs such as shelter, food, and water. And so some of those things are what I'm seeing throughout are taking precedence over even children's education. And so it really asks us to figure out what is going to happen, how is this going to have a long-term effect. I think some of us can, of course, make indications of that. How can we do this and remedy the situation when there is this constant loss of job, and the hope for the vaccines in developing countries is still a mere hope, because we know from recent data that our populations are only going to have about 10 to 15% of them actually getting access to the vaccine. So we are going to experience this type of situation in education for a long time. So how do we continuously try to look at ways in which to mitigate these effects, but with the realities of what is happening on the ground? And that is I don't have an answer, I'll be honest with you. I'm struggling with my teachers in Jamaica to figure out how do they balance, and how do they try to do this work that way.
Going back to the first part of what you were saying, that there is, and I think there's been for a while through the work of people like Stephanie Jones and Larry Aber, a strong body of evidence that shows the academic uplift of SEL interventions for students, but particularly students growing up in different kinds of disadvantage. And so there is the evidence there for a while, but if I'm understanding you correctly, it felt like there was a kind of SEL movement gaining momentum, in the different Caribbean contexts that you were talking about, and COVID has derailed that in many. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, absolutely, Dominic. Absolutely. The impetus now is that there are too many children right now that have not even accessed any form of education since March. And so it's almost at your basic needs, trying to get children back into education. And there are some researchers I spoke to at the University of the West Indies that are doing the collective group work on education through COVID times, that are saying that we are going to have a permanent deficit looking at the time before the Millennium Development Goals, when we were not at universal primary education. And that is frightening. It is absolutely frightening to think of how much gains we've had since the MDG goals, and to think that we are now set back at least 20 years in terms of achieving back that goal.
And so the need for a recalibration towards SEL has never been greater.
Yes.
Than it was before. Mm-hmm. There've been quite a few questions about teacher training and adult understanding of SEL. Laura, I know this is an area that you've worked on, so would you like to come in on some of those questions, if that was okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been enjoying seeing the comments coming in, and they're definitely resonating with a lot of the work that we've been doing. So, one of the recent reports that we issued was a national survey of SEL practices and supports for teachers across the US. And we worked with some folks at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence to use a measure of well-being that they've developed. And so in addition to asking teachers about their practices and their professional development, we asked them about their own emotional well-being. And we found, not surprisingly, that teachers' well-being predicted their emphasis on supporting SEL for students. So teachers who reported higher well-being for themselves were more likely to offer SEL to their students. We also saw, again, not surprisingly, some gaps in teachers' perceived, their own well-being, depending on what kinds of schools they taught in. So teachers who were in schools serving a lot of low-income students, for example, reported lower levels of well-being, somewhat higher levels of burnout. So we saw some of those gaps. And I think that, so when we're thinking about what kinds of supports teachers need to engage in SEL, it goes well beyond the professional development related to how to implement a particular curriculum or how to measure a particular skill. There really is a need for education leaders to pay attention to teachers' own social and emotional skills and well-being. They can't support their children if they're not okay themselves. We did see in response to COVID a decline in teachers' well-being, and a lot of that had to do with, first of all, the same stressors that all of us are facing. Losing in-person access to your colleagues, worrying about how you're going to deal with childcare, health problems, health concerns for yourself or your family, lost income in your family, all those things. In addition to that, remote teaching is hard. We're hearing that hybrid teaching, which is, has become common this year as a way of kind of giving kids a little bit of in-person schooling, that's really hard. It's just taking so much effort and energy that teachers, just don't have, because they're so busy worrying about all of the other stressors in their lives. So I think, as we're thinking about what it is that teachers need, that just supports for their basic well-being has to be really high on the list. And I think along with that is informal professional learning opportunities. So facilitating opportunities for teachers to talk with and learn from and just commiserate with their colleagues, which is something we all need to do, and they often don't have time to do it, and it's gotten harder with COVID. So those are the things I'd put at the top of the list, and we could talk more about PD, but I think start there.
Rand put out some really interesting survey data back in the summer, I think, and if I get this wrong, please jump in and correct me, but it was along the lines of, that schools that had a high culture of teacher collaboration pre-pandemic had been fairly consistently better able to support, or more effective in their support of both the educators and the students learning during school shutdown. So that kind of opens up some really interesting cultural questions about, when we do come out of this phase of the pandemic or this pandemic, what can be done to help more schools create that kind of culture where SEL is embedded in multiple different ways, because there's good evidence that shows the value and the impact of this now.
Yep, absolutely. And culture and climate is sort of one of the legs of the SEL stool, as a lot of organizations talk about it. There's the explicit instruction and the integration into academics, and then the school-wide culture and climate. And that really needs to include the adults as well as the children. And a lot of it comes down to leadership. So starting with a school leader who kind of creates that culture and gives everyone the opportunity to form those solid relationships is a key part of that.
So I'm kind of looking at the clock, and we've had this as a kind of slightly curtailed conversation, but thinking about SEL as a vector or a component of education reform in different contexts, do either of you feel, or do both of you feel, that 2020 could be seen as a landmark year in terms of our collective or wider understanding of the importance of SEL and the need for implementation? Or do you think is it a precarious moment for SEL as a school reform topic?
I can start just because I'm off mute, and Sarah can weigh in. I think there are a lot of opportunities for us collectively to use the experiences of this year as a launching point for a greater system-wide commitment to SEL. You know, again, we educators already recognize the importance of this. There is a risk, I think, that concerns about, you know, the basic needs that Saren talked about, which are obviously crucial, as well as, you know, learning gaps in math and reading that have resulted from lack of access to in-person schooling. There's a risk that those things will sort of take over the policy debates, and we'll forget about, you know, the way that SEL can actually help with all of those things. So I think it's just going to take all of us collectively who are working in this field, practitioners, policymakers, researchers, you know, continuing to have these kinds of discussions and help provide really practical guidance to educators on the ground.
Yeah, I agree with you, Laura. I think the reality is that there are some basic needs that are not being met. And policymakers, especially in global southern countries, are grappling to focus on that. But I do believe that there should not be a let up or an excuse of showing the seamless embeddedness of the need for SEL and the value of it. I think that needs to be stronger than it has ever been. We saw a very contentious year in the US with the elections and the BLM movement and the rhetoric of literal hate just being plastered everywhere. And it had a very globalizing effect, to be quite honest with you. And when you then see how much teachers, not just teachers, but parents in particular, because let's face it, when schools became flattened and the parent became, in many ways, the principal, the teacher, and then some, you know, it was the parents who had to be doing that double work of really embedding all the components, 3 tacit ones, of SEL in their daily life. But in addition to that, having to grapple with, well, is my child meeting their numeracy and literacy benchmarks, right? And that's a reality that not every parent is equipped with, or guardian is equipped with. And I'm talking, in some cases, we're facing guardians. When I've had projects throughout Jamaica, we're talking guardians who are 16 years old. We're talking grandparents, brothers, sisters, siblings, right? And so there is a basic need talk and then an overarching awareness campaign that may need to be followed up in 2021 to show the value, the importance, the effects of when SEL is done properly and implemented. We can yield these numeracy benchmarks, these literacy benchmarks, right? They're not devoided off, they're incorporated. Yeah. But I just don't know if our policymakers are really thinking about that. I'll be very honest in speaking with some of them. I don't know that that's at the top of their agenda.
Right. I just want to chime in on one more thing, which is I think one of the things the pandemic has done is it has pushed innovation in ways that I think will ultimately be beneficial. And I think that, you know, just the fact that we're doing this webinar in this way, you know, I know at least when I was at RAND, they shifted very rapidly toward facilitating remote meetings. Teachers now have lots of ways to kind of engage kids in group activities. Curriculum developers are really thinking hard about how to build in, you know, remote opportunities for SEL promoting activities. And so I think that's the one other piece I just wanted to mention, is that we've seen just a lot of innovation among on the ground educators as well as developers. And I think that sets us up nicely for, you know, to continue offering learning opportunities that will meet a variety of needs. And the family involvement one is crucial as well. Yeah.
It's definitely the case that this year has shown more than any other year in recent memory that education isn't actually that conservative a sector, and when necessary there can be fantastic creative innovation, and you know there's an intersection between the skills and behaviors that you need for that kind of creativity and SEL development as well. Another thing that I was reflecting on when you were both talking is that the sort of idea that SEL can't thrive in a culture of fear. So when you've got populations, whether that's national populations or school populations, who are worried. And, you know, if it's parents worried about their children's attainment, or it's hard to create the mental bandwidth to give time to SEL until the case, you know, for its kind of fundamental necessity is made. I think that speaks to some of what you were saying at the beginning, Laura, about civics and SEL and the need for, you know, it needs to be more embedded in an understanding of how democracies work and democratic practice.
Yep.
On one of these previous roundtables, there was a fantastic quote from a lady from UNICEF, Anya Nielsen, gave about how, you know, in years to come, we might think of COVID having been the test paper and climate change as the actual final exam. And so the kind of need for SEL, for greater deployment of SEL to help parents and students and teachers and populations be better equipped to work with one another moving forward.
So something, Dominic, I've grappled with, to be honest with you, as a parent. You know, I've seen the increased use of the internet and social media and the use of, you know, them being online. And I've often wondered, what are the effects on their social emotional development, empathy levels? Because now we're teaching them, do not hug, do not touch, do not embrace, don't get too close, don't talk when you're eating. And I mean, to try to do that with a 5-year-old is a very interesting observation overall, because they defy all the odds and they would be like, I'm taking off the mask and I'm running to the next person I see. And I wonder oftentimes, what will be the long-term effects of this period of time, right? When the literal teaching, her kindergarten experience is an individualistic experience. It is not a community building experience at all. She's being taught to work alone and independently and not go next to Jim or John because, and they can't even elaborate the reason why perfectly, right? But I do wonder, this entire situation that we're currently in, how much is it that SEL is also being hampered in the individual children's development, because they're literally being taught by their teachers not to be social. Like, social distancing is the word. So it's the anti of SEL. How is that going to be combated, you know?
Well, it's a great point, I suppose, because SEL encompasses such a broad range of different skills and qualities. There is the opportunity or the need to emphasize other SEL skills. So I think, you know, empathy, for example, is one that even in a time of social distancing, you can still, or physical distancing, you can still demonstrate the need for social contact and empathy, you know, and sensitivity to, you know, understanding other people's contexts. So within the totality of the SEL wheelhouse, there are opportunities to develop some skills. But your point about the kind of longer term emotional development consequences of this year is really well made.
Yep. And
sorry, Laura. Fine.
Just really quickly, I think it just highlights the need to be very clear about what we mean when we say SEL. Because it's easy to dismiss, it's easy for policymakers, you know, education leaders to dismiss it as a fluffy, nebulous concept. But when you get down to like what this really means and the impact it has on people, and just thinking about empathy, for example, and how important that is for our democracy, at least in the US and in other areas, to really succeed. I think that you can make a convincing case that these are actually crucial skills for kids to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, with all the different convergent crises that we've talked about in this call, you know, the kind of empathy deficit is a factor in the problem, you know, particularly with Black Lives Matters and the struggle around racial justice, but with many of the others as well, I think. I would love to carry on talking to you both for another hour, but I'm conscious that our audience has almost certainly got other demands on their time. We're going to have to bring it to a close now, but I wanted to thank you both ever so much for sharing so many great ideas and insights, and for giving of your time to be part of this. I've really enjoyed speaking with you both. And I'm going to hand back to Jennifer, who's going to close us out.
Thanks, Dominic. And Laura and Sarah, and I can't resist jumping in on one of the points that you were making. It was this kind of, we really spent a lot of time talking about this dilemma between kind of some of those foundational skills, the literacy and numeracy, and understandingly, parents and policymakers being very concerned about that loss. And on the other side, the SEL, which all of us know is so important for our kids. And just to give you an example of when we were in our district, we started off from looking at literacy and numeracy skills. And we were trying to get at how do we improve those literacy and numeracy skills. And what we came up with was this concept that in order for kids to get better at those skills, they have to be really engaged with their learning. They have to be talking about topics and experiencing, they have to be collaborating together on real world math problems, on real situations of social injustice, et cetera, in the literature that they were reading, et cetera. And that's actually how we improved our achievement in literacy and numeracy. And so we came at kind of at that back end way where we thought in actual fact, the foundational skills are the SEL skills, and that's an important element in our pedagogy. And if our instructional practices are founded on those ideas of having children get a sense of their self-identity, being able to understand how they can socially engage and cooperate and collaborate with others, we're going to build both those skill sets at the same time. And I think that's an interesting place to kind of finish our discussion off, because all three of you talked about how it's not an either or, there's multiple ways of getting at it. I think what we just need to make sure is that our policymakers are well aware that by thinking about the combination of those skills, we have a chance of moving things forward for our kids and for our teachers and for our parents and families. So thanks. I couldn't resist jumping in on the conversation as well. A huge thanks to all three of you. This has been a really great session. We're going to finish off, Harris. I'm just going to get you to throw up a couple of slides just to finish off. Just wanted to make sure that any of you that haven't connected yet, knowledgehook.com/leadership, you'll have access to all of the resources. We've been doing this SEL Global Leadership Series since March. All the past webinars and roundtables are up there, so feel free to connect to that. And we want to reassure you that the three partners have agreed that we will continue on with the SEL Global Leadership series, not uniquely due to the pandemic, but just for a great need and lots of people wanting to have those conversations. So our next session is on January the 14th, and we will make sure that we give lots of time to people to sign up and register and be involved in that conversation. So thanks so much to all of you. Thanks to the participants for your patience this time, and we look forward to seeing you on January the 14th.